Hello, hello, hello. Hey, everybody. How's it going? Hello, let's do this. All right, hello. Welcome back. Krakoa / Casual Krakoa here for the week of July 21st, 2021. We will get formally started in just a few moments. If you are here on the live stream, first off, thank you for joining. Thank you for your patience as I've been on hiatus for a couple weeks here. Had some exciting family news. A third Busing boy has been welcomed into the world. We're extremely excited, but I've been taking some time to catch up on what sleep that I can and, read a bunch of DC comics. I do that sometimes. Played all of God of War with the new baby. I did that in the wee hours of the morning, so some exciting things going on in my end. But I've been catching up on X-Men lately, and I'm excited to get back and talk about it. But yeah, let me know how everything's sounding here, if we have good volume, if we have good picture, and if we have good comics. That might be more opinion-based, but I want to hear that as well. But seriously, thanks to those of you who extended congratulations. I appreciate that quite a bit. But I should be back. I should be back on a regular or semi-regular weekly cadence here going forward as I try to navigate some office hours here during a paternity leave. So otherwise, today is going to be a big day because I haven't done Krakoas on approximately, 3 weeks now of X-Men comics, basically the month of July, right? We had 3 weeks now since the Hellfire Gala. I basically haven't talked about anything here live on YouTube, and I wanted to focus in on X-Men #1 in particular, but I think that's going to help us touch on some of the other comics that have come out since. So I'm seeing here in the chat, things look okay. Thank you for letting me know that. Those of you who are responding in the chat, if you want to get questions in there, I will definitely try to get to as many as I can. Again, the super chat is open and available. And if you want to get your questions in there, I will definitely prioritize them and get to them as we're talking comics today. But the main question that I'm going to be talking about here is, does Hickman's Krakoa really feel like X-Men comics? You probably know how I feel about this if you've been following Krakoa for some time, but I think it's an important one to address. So, hello. Welcome to Casual Krakoa. I'm Dave Busing, founder and editor-in-chief of comicbookherald.com. And again, today we're going to answer the question, does Hickman's Krakoa really feel like X-Men comics? What makes an X-Men comic X-Men, right? I think this is an important question. It's been going on for really since House of X and Powers of 10 in 2019, okay? One of the most consistent refrains I see from readers following House and Powers is that these comics aren't X-Men anymore. This is not super atypical, right? This is I've seen this a bunch. I've seen it from just like your casual reader to someone like Fabian Nicieza said this in an interview when I talked to him, right? Like that's how he feels about this compared to what he's used to from having worked on X-Men for years and years and years, right? So, and actually, for the duration of Hickman's run, this was technically true. like this was 100% true. I mean, Hickman's post House and Powers work is about mutant kind, okay? Not X-Men, which we understand now to refer specifically to the limited superhero roster of specific mutants duly elected by their mutant peers on Krakoa, right? It's a team, like it's a superhero team. Referring to all mutants as X-Men would be like referring to all citizens of Milwaukee as Bucks, which is maybe how you feel today. Congrats on the championship. It pains me to say that. Chicago guy, Bulls fan. But, you got it. And I think Giannis might be good. Finally come around to it. Might be good. So yes, in semantic terms, anyone who felt like Dawn of X lacked what made X-Men feel like X-Men was technically correct. There was no X-Men team. That's true. Mostly, though, when readers are making these claims, they're likely talking less about those semantics and more about the status of Krakoa as a sovereign mutant nation, right? And about the actions taken by many of mutant kind in terms of how much they're looking out for themselves for mutant kind alone, and not the long-held dream of human and mutant integration that Professor X has long been known for, right? That we think of when we think of, especially like 90s X-Men comics. I've already said what I wanted to say on the question of whether or not the X-Men are villains now. Okay, you can find that video on the channel. Just YouTube search, are the X-Men villains now? Mine will probably show up. But the short answer for me is no, certainly not, right? So I'm more interested in the wake of a rebooted X-Men #1, which came out a couple weeks ago. We had a 2021 X-Men #1 relaunch, this time written by Gerry Duggan, art by Pepe Larraz and Marte Gracia, thank goodness, looking at what makes X-Men tick. Like, when people are saying, oh, this is an X-Men now, what are they actually looking for? And what does that mean? Is that an ideal we should be chasing? Is there truth to that is worthwhile, or is the alternative actually better, right? And I think let's talk about it. So I will say first, though, that in response to are the X-Men villains now, which I said I wasn't going to talk about, but I'm going to talk about this part of it. Way of X, the series, the ongoing series, or I guess 5-issue mini, and then there's going to be this big Onslaught revelation coming soon. We had Way of X number 4. Came out over the last few weeks. Written by Cy Spurrier. We got art by Bob Quinn. I'm really enjoying Way of X. No surprise there. I'm a huge Cy Spurrier fan. But that series is really calling into question the heart of Krakoa. Okay? It is indicating, and Cy Spurrier has literally said this, that something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Way of X is putting a big old monkey wrench in the idea of are the X-Men villains now by saying, actually, some of these things that are happening and the way that mutants are acting has been influenced by, an Onslaught entity, by manipulations perhaps of Orcus, injecting Onslaught entities there after some of their experiments on Legion, right? So there's certain implications going on in Way of X that say, like, all of this nation building, all this world building for the Krakoans, there actually are sinister forces at play, perhaps just not the heavily theorized, like, oh, Professor X and Moira are mind controlling the mutants and making them go along with this plan to have, a mutant space in the world, a mutant nation, right? And carve out now a mutant galaxy as we go post-planet-size X-Men, where mutant kind has named Mars, planet Rocco, the capital of the solar system. So that's a wrench, okay? And that's there. But we're going to talk more about what makes X-Men tick and what feels like X-Men, okay? Now, protecting a world that fears and hates them is part of the X-Men mantra. From the Claremont, Uncanny X-Men number 100, Children of the Atom, students of Charles Xavier, mutants feared and hated by the world they have sworn to protect. These are the strangest heroes of all. Okay, that mantra has been true for a long time. I think that's what people are thinking of when they're thinking of X-Men comics. That is like the basis, right? Protecting a world that fears and hates them, I think, is often what it gets, shorthanded to. Let's see if I can find the actual quote itself here on the screen. Okay, right? So, strangest heroes of all. Now, protecting a world that fears and hates them, in Hickman's X-Men, we had the fear and the hate. That's no secret, right? In House of X and Powers of 10, that's there. In the Dawn of X, really across titles, but certainly in X-Men, through entities like Orcus, through entities like Hominis Verendi, we know this is a world that fears and hates mutant kind, but it isn't until the post-Gala launch of Duggan and Larraz on X-Men that protecting really enters the picture, right? So if we're looking at protecting a world that fears and hates them, at least in the super-heroic sense, that part has been missing, by and large. Ironically, though, when you look at the mantra, the world they have sworn to protect, post-planet-size X-Men, that's kind of never been more true, Earth is a mutant world, even with planet Rocco as the capital of this new mutant solar system. Hickman and company have just literalized the protection of that world and made it less like a standard superhero comic, which, given the 60-year history of X-Men comics, yes, please, let's see change. Like, that is, when people say, again, oh, this doesn't feel like X-Men comics now, that's kind of the point. Like, the point of change is that it should feel new and different. And for me, definitely, as someone who reads substantially too many superhero comics that feel less like their predecessors are very, very welcome oftentimes. I think the trickiest thing that creators need to be doing, and that I look for creators doing in Big Two work, across Marvel and DC, is capturing the spirit and sort of the essence, very nebulous things, very nebulous concepts, of what made franchises big hits to begin with, but then doing something we haven't seen before with it, okay? Taking that and twisting it into something that is evolved, right? To use a term that should be very appropriate for X-Men comics, that is evolved from what we've seen. And I think that is the general point of what we're seeing in this era with Hickman's X-Men, okay? But again, like, 6-year history of X-Men comics, yes, please, let's change. But the X-Men have been protecting a world that fears and hates them. They just haven't been doing it like superheroes, I mean, in Ten of Swords, it's another classic example of the X-Men, of mutant kind in this instance, and again, using these terms interchangeably is goofy and doesn't make sense, but it's of mutant kind saving the world. Again, right? It's not that different than like the Dark Phoenix saga in terms of mutants go off, they do a thing, no one's witness to it, and they anonymously save all of humanity. They did the same things, right? They just happen in different contexts and in different eras. I mean, it's interesting in looking back at the most consistently celebrated X-Men work, the Claremont, Cockrum, and John Byrne from Giant Size X-Men #1, let's throw Len Wein in there, I give him credit, through, let's say, Uncanny X-Men number 142, which is the end of the conclusion of Days of Future Past. The X-Men mostly wander from crisis to crisis, putting out emergency fires wherever they go, right? Whether it's the Sentinels in space, the Hellfire Club, the Threat of the Phoenix, Mystique's Brotherhood of Evil Mutants assassination plot from Days of Future Past, right? Leading to dystopia down the line. The X-Men rarely, if ever, take measures to ensure a better mutant future. They just don't have time. They literally save the universe, but perpetual threat response doesn't leave much time for proactive measures, And that, there's nothing wrong with that, okay, right? I like the Claremont run of X-Men quite a bit. That's how superhero comics played in many regards, and of course there's a lot of evolution going on with those creative units as well in terms of X-Men doing it better and doing it bigger, honestly, than a lot of what else was happening in Marvel at the time. I mean, if you go back to the early 80s with Claremont, Cockrum, Byrne, the way they're ticking, I mean, X-Men comics are way more engaging than Avengers. They're probably the only thing in Marvel that they're like, I would say not as good as in that time frame is Frank Miller, Klaus Janson on Daredevil, which is just kind of another tier, right? But it's like they're doing superhero comics better than just about anyone. But again, like they're not looking at, how do we ensure a safe mutant future for all of mutant kind? At least not in aggregate. There are things that will develop as the run develops, but it's not the main focus of that team. They go around doing superhero things all the time, and that was the norm. Now, admittedly, I'm concerned. I was concerned, and I still am to a degree, okay, with the Duggan, Larraz, and Gracia relaunch of X-Men, that it's a regressive slip back to all too familiar superheroics. And don't get me wrong, again, I flippin' really like Marvel superhero comics, but I'm way more into creators taking inventive approaches to stories we haven't seen before. And in a lot of ways, this first issue is totally regressive. I think in most ways, and I think that word, often I mean it as a pejorative, but here it's not necessarily all bad. I mean, the new X-Men team literally moves into a treehouse in New York City to fight threats like the Avengers or Fantastic Four would. It's literalizing, we're going to become the standard Marvel superhero team. The team Voltron's together to fight an alien entity, which is simultaneously fun and way too reminiscent of tricks Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo pulled with the Justice League in very recent memory. Like that to me, actually, I couldn't have fun with that because it was too much of a ripoff of something that like Snyder and Capullo just did in Metal. Which is, again, a function of you're reading too many superhero comics. I get it. Nonetheless, Larraz and Gracia, I mean, they elevate Duggan's work in this comic so that it feels special. I think any other art team, I think this book would be an absolute dud, potentially. Instead, it feels like an event. It also unquestionably feels like a familiar X-Men book, So as we've been saying, it doesn't feel like X-Men anymore. X-Men #1 feels like X-Men now, or at least it should, in all the ways that Hickman's did not. And again, the whole X universe did the work to build to this point. We got Scott and Jean justifying the need for the team in Ten of Swords and the election in the Hellfire Gala. An X-Men superhero team is justified in the Krakoa era and is clearly not just a regressive response to perceived backlash. I think that's extremely important. I've been thinking about this a little bit. I talked in a video not too long ago. I went back and I read a bunch of the Chuck Austen X-Men for reasons. And, it follows Grant Morrison's turn on New X-Men from 2001 to 2004. Grant Morrison's is, of course, kind of the tabula rasa of Hickman's run. It's definitely, the point where change, where looking at mutants on a global level was at the forefront in a way that it, really hadn't been and frankly hasn't really been since until Hickman. And that run is followed up by Chuck Austen on a bunch of different X-Men books in addition to other creators. But there's a real conservative approach post Morrison that the X-Men comics took, where they were like, well, that was weird and we upset some people. We better get back to basics, and back to basics gets thrown around in comics all the time. It's kind of the nature of superhero comics that inevitably you want to reset. You want to put Peter Parker back in high school, right? That sort of thing. But Chuck Austen run, it's like the back to basics approach can be very, very disappointing. And this X-Men #1 is not that. I want to be clear. This is not, better get X-Men back to basics. I don't think we'll see that until post-Inferno, post the conclusion of the Hickman era of X-Men, in 2028. But, so like, I want to be clear, like, this is not the back to basics thing, but it's a little bit that. Now, my favorite aspect of X-Men #1 is the creative team's willingness to playfully add to the threats this X-Men team will face. Remember, in a post-House and Powers world, the usual villainous suspects of Magneto, Mr. Sinister, Mystique, etc., are all, in their traditional way, off the board. So we have to use and utilize and create new threats, which is exciting. That's what this era should be, right? Like that's the type of threat, and that's the type of approach to X-Men comics that I want to be seeing. So we have Cordyceps Jones as this alien, creature, this alien entity off-world who's part of this gaming planet. I think Cordyceps was actually from the Al Ewing written Rocket miniseries that like no one ever talks about, where Rocket's like a PI investigator. Ewing did a Guardians issue in this current Guardians run that makes has a lot of fun with Rocket as this sort of PI investigator. I actually think that issue is better than the entire Rocket miniseries. But nonetheless, that's where that character is from. I don't think they've ever been used since. And then we have Fei Long, this tech figure who basically he was doing everything to get to Mars. He changed his body to make it Mars ready, and then was watching as the mutants made Mars ready for mutants, right? And basically all of his hard work was completely undone. And we have this interesting situation where we have a villain who doesn't necessarily hate mutants for being mutants and for being different. He hates them for being so successful at the thing he was trying to do, right? So it's an interesting, actually, inversion. And we have that character investigating, and we see Ben Urich, the classic Marvel newspaper journalist, investigating this question as well. How are the mutants resurrecting their dead? So we finally have people coming around to like, hey, it sure seems like Gemma Carnation died very publicly. Not that long ago, in Marvel timelines. What's going on there? How is he around? How is he making all of the fashion for the Hellfire Gala very, very publicly? Which I think, that was my theory for a Hellfire Gala revelation, was for Emma to out that like, hey, we have resurrection now, you can't kill us. That did not happen. That theory was way off. But nonetheless, it's still mildly secret, but like mutants aren't being that careful about it. So it's going to get outed. People are going to figure it out. And then again, I think like that's going to make them more susceptible, because again, when you put resurrection on its heels, like Ten of Swords did, all of a sudden mutant kind is in trouble. So, I mean, X-Men #1, like it feels like an X-Men comic, I think, in the ways that, a lot of the readers who were saying, oh, this isn't X-Men anymore, probably were talking about. I think that it does. And I think it kind of succeeds on the merits of Larraz and Gracia being incredible. Again, like just the fact that they were, I've talked about this before, but like the fact that they did the art for House of X, and then anything they draw now, including like the Ten of Swords tentpole issues, like anything they draw now just feels like an event. So while Duggan's work here, in terms of story with Larraz and Gracia isn't necessarily exceptional, it doesn't actually have to be when you're working with creators of this talent, and it makes me want to continue reading X-Men just because, Larraz and Gracia are on it, or for as long as they're on it. I do feel like this is a series that could really, really suffer if it goes the way of fill-in artists. Often, many series do. But nonetheless, like it's splitting the middle fairly successfully right now of catering to the, this is what X-Men should feel like, fandom, as well as building and being a part of the Krakoa era, because it is. Again, it's justified. We built to this moment. It makes sense that we'd have an X-Men team now doing superhero things in New York. And, you think about it too, like on a Krakoan PR level, an X-Men team makes a lot of sense. Mutant kind right now is in this business of gathering wealth as leverage, of gathering PR as leverage, of a kind of in the business entity that we see like in X Corp, which is a book I'm very much not enjoying. I think it's really bad. I think it could be worse than Fallen Angels, and it pains me to say that. Like, it's not actually worse than Fallen Angels, but it is bothering me on a similar level. But regardless, the PR of having a mutant team publicly saving New York, that's great for mutant kind. That's a good thing. They need that, right? Because there's a lot of anti-mutant sentiment, and sentiment is still a thing they kind of care about, even as they go to Mars and those sorts of things, right? I think it's an interesting book. I'm excited about where it's going. I'm curious what you all thought of X-Men #1, but I think just again to the question of, does Hickman's X-Men, does the Krakoa era really feel like X-Men comics? I think when you look at the mantra and when you look at what we think mutants are supposed to be doing in the Marvel Universe, I really think it does. And I think if you're taken aback by some of the changes, that's probably less to do with, in my opinion, that has less to do with like what these X-Men comics should actually be versus just the nostalgia of it literally not being the 1991 Jim Lee, Whilce Portacio X-Men stuff, right? Like there's a nostalgic element where, yeah, comics have progressed in 30, 40, 50 years whenever you last were familiar with them. And I think like there's the types of questions and the types of issues they're dealing with, they've just gotten a lot bigger, because it's a real big picture era. We're looking at, how does mutant kind fit globally? How do they fit in an Earth where they have a nation, Krakoa? It's not the first time mutant kind has moved to a distinct location, Asteroid M, Genosha, Utopia, right? These things have happened throughout X-Men history. What makes this unique and what makes this different is there's actually a plan, and there's a plan that expands into space, and expands into galaxies, and expands across timelines, because we're looking at true survival of a species across basically an infinite array of timelines. And I think that's what makes this era so incredibly interesting. So all that stuff to me is super additive, like that is, take X-Men as a concept, take X-Men as a comic, add stuff to it, make it more interesting, let it evolve, make it better. It's not taking anything away from what you liked about mutant kind, and I think to the point of like, characters acting differently now or something, right? Or even Professor X, it's like, yeah, they've had experiences that have radicalized them. This is what we look for in the impossibly long-term storytelling of comics, is character growth, despite the urge to reset the factory, right? Despite the urge to go back to basics. What makes Marvel Comics interesting, and all the stuff that I like the most, is when characters actually have substantial growth through the decades, as slowly as it might progress, right? Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson's relationship, for example, is most interesting because of the decades of experience that they've gone through together, right? We don't need to reset to MJ dancing at the drop of everyone's ringtone. You know what I mean? Like she would have done in the 60s, okay? But where they are now, I think, is increasingly interesting. So I think Hickman's Krakoa really does feel like X-Men comics to me. I think that's why I'm enjoying it so much. The most I've enjoyed X-Men comics straight up in a decade. But nonetheless, I mean, like, there's, this X-Men #1, this Duggan relaunch, is definitely going to be like the big superhero team that people often are looking for when they're looking for X-Men comics. When you think about the Claremont and Cockrum, when we think about the Byrne, when we think about any of the famous eras of X-Men, I think that's, the first issue at least makes it feel like that's what this is going to be. And I do think it's kind of amazing, like the world building, how much Hickman and let's give credit to Larraz and RB Silva and Marte Gracia, how much House and Powers bought goodwill, like for every other run through the Dawn of X and Reign of X. Like, it's incredible how good those books are, and how good that is as a setup for the world and for this era, and how much goodwill that bought everyone. Because I really think it's only been, the last several months where we've started to see that goodwill fall away. It's incredible that it lasted as long as it did, because truly, go back, look at the Dawn of X lineup, which I like, and I've talked positively about vast majority of what's happening there. Those books don't make it beyond, 12, 15 issues without the backdrop of House and Powers. They just don't, not in Marvel's current economy. That says less, or not economy, but current climate. I mean, it doesn't even say that much about the quality of the books themselves, so much as just like books that aren't staples at Marvel just don't get to run. A book called Marauders, the chances of that going 11, 12 issues beyond that, making it to a 22nd issue today, that absolutely doesn't happen without the world building and the success of House and Powers. And I know that probably seems like really obvious. Like, yes, of course, if it had not been incredibly successful, these things wouldn't continue happening. But it's just like, none of this would still be going. It bought so much goodwill for all these creators, and we're starting to see it fall away a little bit with Hickman not in the picture for a few months. Like all of a sudden there's a little gap. And it's going to look dumb when Inferno hits, because it's going to come, it's going to be incredible, there's going to be all these huge ideas. X-Men's going to seem amazing again. I'm super confident in that. But now we have a gap between Hellfire Gala and the Trial of Magneto hitting, and then the Onslaught Revelation and Inferno, all this stuff coming in August and September. But there's a little gap, right? This is a rest period where the ongoing series can kind of just do their thing. And I think what you realize, and what a lot of readers are realizing, is that all the ongoing series are not for them, right? Like there's a handful of ongoing series, and I'll just speak for myself here, like that I'm way less into. I think the cream of the crop right now is really dominated by Hellions, Sword, Way of X, and probably something I'm forgetting, because I don't have it in front of me like a fool, right? But you got Hellions, Sword, Way of X. I think New Mutants is typically good, although today was fine. But again, like, that's a very, very high top tier. And then everything else is kind of doing its thing. It's kind of middle of the road. I'm not crazy excited about too much that's happening in those, just in terms of like the general status quo. Those need the injection of an Inferno, I think. I do think we need we had Planet Size X-Men, we had the Hellfire Gala as a status quo change. I think that we need to continue pursuing that in really interesting ways for these books that have been going for a while. Your Marauders, your New Mutants, Excalibur, for example. These books need that injection of energy, and I think you need the change that Inferno is going to bring. Whether, and obviously I've talked about Inferno theories here and there. So, all right, I'll stop there. I'm curious, but and then my point with that essentially is like, I think we're seeing the limits of the gap between Hickman's X-Men and Inferno right now, in terms of just maybe a general malaise with X-Men comics, where it's like you almost forget, because the era has such high highs, that like your standard monthly superhero comic pauses and it catches its breath, and it's not always crazy exciting. And I think one thing this era of X-Men has done, it has been very good at making it feel like every week there's something super exciting to talk about. And that's not always true in superhero comics, right? Like if you're following Thor, for example, a book that I actually think has gotten better throughout the Donny Cates run. I think it started rough. It's gotten a little bit better. But every issue is not incredible. It's built for like consuming his full story. It's built for the trade, for the Marvel Unlimited binge in a lot of ways. And I think with X-Men, actually, we forget that sometimes, that a lot of these series are either playing the long game, which isn't always a good excuse. I think some of these series are, playing too long of a game. I think you need to deliver more up front, make these things exciting on a week or a month-to-month basis. But all right, let me know what you think. And thanks to everybody who has jumped in the super chat here. I'm gonna pause quick and try to get to some questions. All right, it says here, if you have a problem with the current X-Men, then you have the same problem with Inhumans. Inhumans are a genetic monarchy. Where are the Inhumans? Does anybody know? What happened to the Inhumans? Did they go the way of when ABC Marvel's Inhumans was such a tremendous dud? Did Marvel actually just write all of them out of the universe? I'm not reading literally everything in Marvel. I mostly just keep up with X-Men and then catch up on other stuff later. But I would love to know the last Inhuman sighting anyone had. I don't think there are any major plans for the Inhumans in this era of X-Men. But given Hickman's, interest in them to a degree, with his use of them in Fantastic Four, and using Black Bolt, and again Black Bolt's connections to Vulcan, which is one of the bigger dangling plot threads we have going in this era of X-Men. I really hope Inferno touches on the Vulcan dangling plot threads. I think that could be, everyone's focused right now on, Mystique's going to burn it to the ground to bring Destiny back. But hardly anyone is talking about the fact that like Vulcan is being or has been manipulated and controlled by some weird cancerverse alien entities. Like, I hope that comes back in Inferno. That those are sort of the the demon-like creatures that we see that erupt on Krakoa, right? Because if we're looking at 89 Inferno as a touch base and kind of a spiritual homage to that event, that has literal demons of limbo, is led by Sim, is led by Madeline Pryor, the Goblin Queen, coming and invading Krakoa. So who do we get to come and invade? Because if it's Mystique, I'm going to burn it to the ground. Mystique doesn't have an army. So could that have more to do with Vulcan's dangling plot thread and whatever the heck happened with him in the Cancerverse and these weird alien entities? I kind of hope so. Because that's a big one that's hanging out there. But nonetheless, Black Bolt has connections to him through War of Kings, through Hickman writing that during Fantastic Four. I think we could see Black Bolt again, and I think we can and will see the Inhuman Horse Sea factions, forgetting their names, the Light Brigade, because both Hickman has used them and Al Ewing used them in his Royals series, and had them show up in Sword in the Galactic Council. So I bet we'll get little nods here and there. I'm seeing some people in the chat, saying like that the Inhumans all died. I mean, I read Death of the Inhumans. Clearly don't remember it. I guess we see Lockjaw, right? We see Lockjaw with Beta Ray Bill in Guardians of the Galaxy. So Lockjaw's around because you can't kill a dog. It's not right. But otherwise, I guess there was a series called Death of the Inhumans, and I don't actually remember most of them dying. That's probably my least favorite Donny Cates miniseries. I think I'll throw that out there. But nonetheless, all right, Inhumans due for a comeback. You can't keep a good Black Bolt down. Too cool a design, too good of a name, Black Eagle Boltagon. And we'll see Lockjaw. We'll see probably Maximus the Mad and Medusa. Will we see them all in this era of X-Men? I bet we'll see them in some cosmic stuff. I bet they'll get a moment. So, all right, we have one other good question here that I want to get to. I just wish the team had at least one physically mutated member. Also, why only 7 members and not 10? Either way, glad to have you back. Mazel tov. Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Or that's an interesting point, honestly, to actually have someone whose mutation manifest physically. I think actually would be kind of meaningful and kind of useful. Instead, we have a very superhero looking, right, X-Men unit, which has been, you don't even have the Nightcrawler, right? You don't even have the Kurt Wagner of the group, who can't present as human and pass as human like these other characters can. I'm with you on that. I think that would be a good addition. Why only 7 and not 10? That's an interesting question. 7 seems fine to me. I gotta say, I don't have a lot of thoughts on the numbering of the team. Here's the thing: in the NBA Finals, you're only gonna play 7 guys. You don't need all 10, right? Three of your players are gonna stay on the bench, and they're not gonna get utilized. Really, you're only gonna be able to play 7. So honestly, by that logic, I think 7's fine for the super team. That works for me. All right, we got some other super chats coming in. I'm gonna pull those up, and then I'm gonna talk a little bit about the comics that actually did come out today, day of release. We had New Mutants number 20 and Marauders number 22. But yeah, keep the questions coming here in the chat. Keep the theories coming. Again, super chat, I will definitely prioritize. Here's a question that I'm just looking at. Jay asks, do you believe Sabretooth will be freed during Inferno? 98.9% yes. I would be very surprised if we don't get a trip, journey to the center of Krakoa to free Sabretooth, to bring him onto Mystique's team. And again, I've predicted this in the past, but I think the Victor Laval series that has been announced and not named or given any further details is very likely to be a Sabretooth series. So I kind of hope so. That's the promise of Inferno right now is, hey, all those dangling plot threads, which, you could call them dangling plot threads, or you could call them, hey, all those plots that Hickman intentionally seeded throughout the last couple of years. We're going to touch on as many of those as is feasible, I think. Is it literally going to be everything? Probably not. I think it's going to be a lot of them. I really do. The one that I'm not sure will get touched on here, actually I'm pretty confident it won't, is the long theorized and held up example of when Doug Ramsey visits Krakoa for the first time and he touches a leaf on Krakoa and it goes all techno-organic, warlocky. I don't think that'll get touched here. I don't think we're going to get any Warlocky. We're not going to get any Phalanx until Endgame. So that's my theory there. All right. So let's look at the first comic that came out today, New Mutants number 20. Writer Vita Ayala, artist Alex Linz filling in for Rod Race, colors Matt Miller, letters by Travis Lanham. I've enjoyed New Mutants a lot. I think it's a really good book. Everyone connected to the Shadow King in this book is broken and cruel, and I think that's intentional. But it does make basically every character kind of suck. Like Wolfsbane is again broken and cruel. Anole, Rainboy, Cosmar, No Girl in particular, who takes over the body of. Spoiler alert! If you haven't read anything for a month, so bail now. For Scout, who died or seemingly died at the end of the Hellfire Gala, right? So the big reveal in New Mutants at the end of the Hellfire Gala was Gabby, aka Scout, I guess we're calling her, Laura Kinney's sister, Wolverine, clone sister. She died at the end of the Hellfire Gala. So it seems like after she went to invest, every implication is it's Shadow King related, but obviously, like, well, that'd be pretty obvious. So is it? And now her friends, Anole, Rainboy, Cosmar, No Girl, they're all going to investigate. Not even really investigate. They're just like, they're trying to get her resurrected without telling anyone. And No Girl in particular, so No Girl is like the brain. She's like a brain in a jar. And a bunch of people have asked, like, why wasn't she resurrected with a body? Because Krakoa offers that, right? It's like you could get a husk, you could really change the game for mutants who have issues like that. And No Girl comes out here inhabiting Scout's body and is like, yeah, I wanted one. That sucks that they didn't do anything, which is super bizarre because I thought No Girl could like communicate telepathically or at least other ways. So I was a little thrown by that. But again, I don't know how much here maybe is the influence of the Shadow King. Like how much here is maybe Shadow King goading on people's worst impulses and kind of making them act slightly out of character versus looking back on this era and saying like, oh wow, yeah, Anole like really was a jerk here. Why? Like why was that the case? If it's not Shadow King related, that's actually going to be, I think, a big flaw in this run. But again, like the kid friends of Scout here, they're venturing to try to resurrect Scout, and it doesn't make any sense why they think they have to do this themselves, other than it actually feels like pretty sound kid logic. Like it feels like sound, like a young kid, like, oh, we have to do this weird sneaky thing. My main question with this is, shouldn't the Arbor Magna have slightly better security? Where the husks and resurrection protocols in the 5 actually happen, shouldn't that be a little better protected than letting 4 mutant kids basically wander in there until Wolfsbane happens to find them? Again, just I'm always harping on this, but like classic example of Krakoa just not thinking everything through, which is intentional. I enjoyed Warpath and Magic investigating a new mutant power manifestation, only to find a town actually protecting the mutant and trying to prevent it being taken to Krakoa. It's the opposite of the trope. And as James recognizes here, he's like, yeah, this mutant can stay with her mom. Like, we're not going to force someone to go to Krakoa. But usually when a mutant's powers develop and an earthquake happens, the townsfolk are all pitchforks and angry, right? So, but it was fine. It was a fine issue of New Mutants. I'm missing Rod Race's work on this, definitely. I think it's a better series. I do think, like, okay, we've been building the Shadow King thing for a while. Like, we need to get more from this, I think. Not even a resolution, which I know will come, but, like, we need more details about what is actually happening here, who can actually see him, why is it all happening, kind of what the implications are. I don't... If this plays it out too long, it's gonna suffer. But otherwise, it's been fine. The Krakoan for the next episode reads Wolf and Sheep. I don't know. It didn't really excite me, I think. And again, like, that's kind of, with the exception of X-Men #1, which is uniquely new, most of what's come out, since I've not been talking about it on Casual Krakoa, honestly, with the exception, and Wave X #4. Wave X #4 had some big stuff. But a lot of it has just felt like, okay, like we're playing through the hits here, we're playing through the plots. We're gonna burn some clock here until we get to Inferno. And that's how superhero comics work, right? It's not super surprising. Before we get to Marauders #22, let's get a couple questions here. So if in the end of Inferno we have a change in the Silent Council or the Quiet Council, who do you think should be in there? So I think for sure we'll have a change. Probably I think it's going to be even bigger than the Quiet Council. I mean, I think like we're going to be looking at probably like new mutant nations or some sort of separation from Krakoa, at least by some faction of mutants. Who will actually be the Krakoan? Like, will we even have a Krakoan Quiet Council? Is a fair question. Coming out of Inferno, I think that we will. I think we lose Mystique. Probably, do we lose Sinister at this point? I don't know. That one's up for debate. Who do I think could be in there that isn't right now? That might still be around. That's an interesting question. I mean, Selene has been an interesting option. I think to date, again, just with a character who has tremendous knowledge. I think you could totally flip the script and put Amal Farouk on there, Shadow King, once we get out of the New Mutant saga. I think, again, that's a character that has a very long history that would you need somebody who has that almost apocalypse-like knowledge of the way the world works because they've lived so long. I think that would be really useful. I would love Forget-Me-Not on the Quiet Council, and then the council constantly thinking they're one short and trying to elect new people, and Forget-Me-Not just sitting there being like, what, this is my spot? I think that would be it's a really stupid gimmick. Who else? I think Dr. Nemesis would actually make some sense, but that'll never happen. Who else could we do? Who else? I mean, Colossus would make a decent amount of sense if you want to kind of go with the old guard of X-Men, because we got Storm gone at this point. We got Jean Grey being ineligible. Nightcrawler's sitting a little bit alone in terms of the old guard. So I don't know. I guess Old Man Cable. Actually, I would really like. I think that would actually be one of my favorite thoughts as I talk this out loud. Old Man Cable has the knowledge of the timelines. He has the cojones to stick up to Professor X and Magneto if he's still around, on Krakoa at this point. So I think that'd be cool. Assuming Abigail Brand mentioned here in the comments. I mean, she's running Sword. She's too busy to also be on the Quiet Council. I just don't even think she'd want to play their games. I mean, if we could add, I don't think we're going to add anybody from Planet Arakko, right? Because they have their great ring. Because otherwise, I'd want to see Iska the Unbeaten and all those characters who I absolutely just want to see more of. Still, I would love, and I feel like not a lot of people are so Inferno. Everyone's very focused on what's going to happen with the Krakoan players, right? And Mystique's going to burn it all down to get Destiny back, and Emma Frost obviously has a huge role here, and probably is going to, figure out a lot of the secrets of what's going on. But I feel like in talking about this, very few people are talking about but what of Planet Arakko? And how does Iska the Unbeaten fit into any of this, and all these other characters? I would really like Hickman to continue developing then, and also laying the groundwork and setting the stage for those characters to have more of a role in the future. I've talked about this in the past, but 1,000,000% I would read a book called The New Mutants focused on those Arakko mutants. I think that'd be awesome. So I mean, those are some options. I think, Old Man Cable's probably my favorite pick that I talked about there, who could fit on the new Quiet Council. It's kind of a tricky one, honestly. It is. It's a little tricky one. I'm sure there are other good options as well, but just none of them are immediately popping to mind. All right, so how does this all end? This is a question from the super chat. Thanks so much for contributing. How does this all end? Moira versus Destiny, Mars versus Mercury Sentinel City, Galactus and Phoenix versus Dominions. I mean, the last question, yes, but no. We seeded Dominions and these galactic societies, and the fact that the only thing that they fear is Galactus and the Phoenix, so that's gonna come up. I think probably with the Phoenix and not Galactus being X-Men, but who's to say for sure. I think it's all gonna end with, my thought would be, the techno-organic phalanx side of things, some sort of massive invasion, and the mutant solar system needing to deal with the phalanx and needing to deal with the built-to dominions. I think all of this galactic society stuff is the long game of all of this. I think in terms of how Inferno ends, I mean, I've talked about this a little bit before, but I think my favorite version of how Inferno ends right now is, well, first off, is an idea I never have thought of and never will think of, because that will be the best reading experience. But my favorite version of how it could end is something to the effect of Moira recognizing she needs Destiny, of bringing her back, and of that actually setting the stage for like them, working together and actually, creating, basically like Moira finally making the right choice and now actually setting the stage for a future timeline, possibly in the Life 11, where mutant kind is successful. I think probably a more likely scenario, again, as I've said, is like a splintering of Krakoa. I think Inferno is going to fracture Krakoa. We're going to get different factions. Maybe we get a resurrection of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, as led by Mystique and Destiny. Maybe we get a new mutant island. However it's going to work, I do think we're going to get the separation of Krakoa as a mutant paradise, because it's gone about as far as it could. So be curious, what other people think there. All right, so let's talk lastly here about Marauders number 22, which also came out today. Again, get in your questions now, and I will get to as many as we can. So writer Gerry Duggan, art by Matteo Lally, flipping Klaus Janson on the flashback on the classic X-Men 6 Redux that Duggan works in here. Colors by Rain Burrito and letters by Corey Pettit. We have a thematic issue here of abusive men in these women's lives, of Lord Chantel and also Wilhelmina Kensington. I think it is approached fairly clumsily and definitely not, I think, maybe the right creators involved, Duggan in particular, to tackle these types of issues. But you can see the positive intentions, I think, in decrying these abusive men. So the Step for Cuckoos here in Marauders 22, they deal with Wilhelmina Kensington, and seemingly made things even worse. Now, they did this back in the Hellfire Gala, and my theory then was like, oh, maybe they recognized she was a mutant, and they unlocked her genetic potential. But actually, it's a lot worse than that, because they have, without permission, messed with her mental health and past trauma, and basically are making her relive it. It looks like still possibly revealing a latent X gene, but we don't know for sure in this issue. I mean, it kind of just reads like the Stepfords are torturing Wilhelmina, which, again, she's one of the 4 Hellfire kids, the Hominis Verendi, so, not the most likable person in the world, but still, the Stepfords seem just way, way out of line with what they're doing. And, I think ultimately, again, it'll probably reveal that, she's probably a latent mutant. But it's a weird way to go about it, okay? And the Stepfords seem to think their actions are more heroic than I think they actually come across. Emma also reveals here that there's the secret history of Lord Chantel. Lord Chantel is a character who's literally had one appearance before this. I think it showed up in Classic X-Men number 6, again written by Chris Claremont, art by John Bolton. That's the Hellfire Gala, predecessor. It's the first Hellfire Gala before the Hellfire Gala we just had, at least that we actually saw in comics. Sebastian Shaw sucks throughout it, and we learned here he sucks even more than we realized. He's an abuser of Lord Chantel, who is his girlfriend. I'm not sure putting Lord's. So what Emma reveals here is in that issue, Lord's, she teleports the team to this facility that's under attack by Sentinels. She is ultimately killed trying to save Sebastian Shaw's life, despite him being the worst to her. And this really emotionally resonates with him. He wants to resurrect her now because, she's his lost love, again, despite the fact that he is the worst. What Emma reveals here is that actually she didn't die. She just needed to get away from Sebastian Shaw. And in order to do that, Emma made everyone believe she died, but faked her death with the Sentinels. And then Emma actually put her in the hands of the Kingpin. Now, I'm not sure putting Lords with the Kingpin is anything but out of the frying pan into the fire, but it does totally open an interesting secret history for her character's return. To what end? Feels like a fair question. What exactly are we building towards there? I don't know, but it's interesting. It's an interesting twist on, again, an issue that has only because of the Hellfire Gala become really kind of top of mind, I think, for a lot of X-Men readers. I do appreciate Marauders 2 ending with Bishop and the War Captains prepping for the return of Nimrod 2.0. Although, again, I will say, I'm not crazy about data pages that have zilch to do with what's happening in the issue. Marauders number 22 is not a comic that is dealing with the return of Nimrod. Bishop doesn't even show up in this comic. So to, jack in a data page, a little text memo that is like, hey, we war captains need to get ready for Nimrod 2.0. Like, it just has nothing to do with this issue, so I find that a little strange. Don't love it, I don't think, as a comics craft, technique. But nonetheless, like, conceptually, I do like the idea that they're talking about it, and that they're focused on it. They request. Oh, I guess the connection here would be they're requesting the return of Harry Leland, who is in that classic X-Men issue, part of the Hellfire Club from that time period, has the mutant ability to like increase things mass. So that's in the classic fight with the Hellfire Gala in the Hellfire Mansion. Harry Leland increases Wolverine mass, drops him through the through the basement floors. That's how you get that iconic John Byrne panel of him saying, now it's my turn. But Harry Leland apparently has not been resurrected since he was killed by the first Nimrod, and basically, like, I don't want to say gave his life, but like lost his life in battling the Nimrod the first time. Some weird resurrection protocol stuff going on, right? In terms of like who gets to get brought back, who like certain like Karma, has been through New Mutants now. Crucible got to get resurrected just to get her brother back, like re-resurrected, like for a benefit. Yet Harry Leland's still sitting on the sitting on the door. I understand what's going on there, right? Why are certain individuals just straight up not resurrected? Same would go for Thunderbird, Proudstar, which I think came up somewhere else that I read too. And there's some questions to be asked about, like, why are some mutants just straight up not getting resurrected? Obviously, and then in addition to, of course, Destiny and Blindfold, which we know the reason there at least. So there's this idea of mutant circuits as a solution, using Arakko as a landscape to defeat Nimrod. I'm interested in all that. I'm interested in, like, okay, what can mutants do this time to actually take down a Nimrod 2.0? Going to be tricky, but all right, I'm coming up on the end here. I'm going to get to as many questions as I can before I go. Let me know any questions you have here in the chat. Thanks for joining, everybody. The triumphant return of Casual Krakoa. I appreciate everybody who was able to join live. And again, I will be back on a planned weekly basis here, talking all things X-Men comics. I will at least be doing Casual Krakoas. Again, like, I'll do, a proper Kraken Krakoa if an issue has a lot going on, but again, today, like, I didn't, between New Mutants and Marauders, like, those issues don't have that much going on, so I didn't need to. Destiny, this is a question here from the super chat. Thanks so much for contributing. Destiny has given Mystique only one other opportunity to bring her back in a story. Don't you think Destiny would choose to tell Mystique the best time to bring her back? Destiny give Hickman untapped stories. Let's see. I don't think Destiny would tell Mystique the best time, because Destiny's information is always pretty nebulous, right? I don't think Destiny's power, the way it manifests, she doesn't necessarily control the specificity to say, oh, be here at this time, at this place, and then resurrect me, and then this is exactly how it happened, right? The information that she gave to Mystique, which definitely I could see Hickman pulling the trick of being like, hey, remember that conversation where Destiny told her to burn it all down? Yeah, there are like 4 more paragraphs after that, right? He's used that trick a bunch. He did it with Apocalypse and Genesis. He used it in East to West all the time. That would not surprise me a ton. But nonetheless, I think, Destiny probably gave Mystique as much information as she could articulate. And that's what you would get, So I do think, the idea of the Destiny Diaries and her history and these futures, that does give us a world of untapped stories that I would love to see play out. I think that's why it was so exciting in the last issue of X-Men, where we finally see Moira and we see what she's been doing, and we see that she's been reading Destiny's Diaries. I mean, that's awesome. That rules. I would love to see her actually, following the threads on those sorts of things. But I think honestly, like, top 2 question for me in Inferno is, do we actually get Destiny resurrected? And does Hickman and company, do they actually fulfill the promise of this character, this precognitive mutant that, remember, like, before House and Powers, Destiny was not cool. like Destiny was, listen, I'm sure the character has fans. Obviously, the fact that Destiny and Mystique are in a romantic relationship or marriage is a big deal in the Marvel Comics universe, but Destiny was not cool in my view, and House of Powers made her super cool. They made her the nemesis of Moira X, the best and coolest reconsidered mutant in the Marvel universe. So I think, can they fulfill that promise when Destiny actually comes back, when we're actually dealing with her diaries? That's a tricky thing. And I'm really excited to see it play out. So, all right. Some mutants aren't brought back because their deaths were known to the public, like Thunderbird, and that would let enemies know about resurrection. I mean, that would make sense, but for Jumbo Carnation, right? And probably there are others, but like, I mean, Wolverine, for example, like there are mutants who have died very publicly. Jumbo Carnation was on all the hottest press in New York, right? Big fashion personality. Died in a violent, a hate crime, right? That was news. And then this character is back, manufacturing things and creating the clothes for the Hellfire Gala. Again, Death of Wolverine. I don't know exactly how public that was, but like certainly the hero community knew about something like that. And he came back. He came back before Krakoa, didn't he? Bad example. But Jumbo Carnation definitely. I think is an example. Now with Thunderbird, my working theory is two-piece. Thunderbird can't be resurrected, and Thunderbird is, for those who don't know, Proudstar is one of the original X-Men from Giant Size X-Men in 1975. He died 2 issues later in X-Men number 95 by Chris Claremont and Dave Cockrum, like on the X-Men, on the all-new Storm, Wolverine, Colossus, Nightcrawler team on their first mission. Thunderbird dies. Should be one of the first in line to get resurrected. My working theory is Professor X didn't have Cerebro backups in place at that time. They got set up after that in response to that, perhaps. And the second part of it would be, we know Mr. Sinister is using Thunderbird's DNA, and that somehow that messes with the possibility of resurrecting the actual Thunderbird. But then Sinister would have to tell everyone that he's using Thunderbird's DNA and have that be a reason that everybody stood by. So that kind of doesn't make sense to me. But I do think that just in terms of like the world at large is going to find out about a resurrection soon enough. I think already like they're not being secretive enough about it. If they wanted to sort of perpetually keep that on ice, I don't think. So all right, let's see if there's any other final good questions I want to get to. Otherwise, we will call it a day. I mean, so all right, let's bring it full circle. Ramsey here says, I'm gonna call you out. Hickman turned X-Men into East of West. It's compelling, but it's not X-Men. I think that is very much in line with what I was talking about at the very beginning of this, right? At the very beginning of all this, saying, does Hickman's Krakoa feel like X-Men? And I think it's not untrue to say that, like, it feels like East of West, right? This other East of West is a creator-owned book that Hickman did with artist Nick Dragotta. I think it's very, very good. It came out via Image Comics, and it's looking at a sort of, it's like a post-apocalyptic Western of sorts with a lot of mythology and prophecy and godlike characters, okay? And definitely there are pieces of that are injected into this run on X-Men. I think in some ways it's less about taking from East of West and putting it in X-Men and more about just like, that's just how Hickman writes and how he tells stories. East of West is just kind of the best example of that because it's like Hickman's longest running ongoing indie, ongoing creator-owned work. Like he just hasn't done anything else as long as he did East of West. So it feels it's the most Hickman, and obviously a lot of that's going to get into X-Men because creators are who they are. I think you're right that it feels like East of West. I think what I continue to disagree with is the idea that it's this compelling story, but it has no roots in X-Men comics. And again, like just going back to the mantra, protecting a world that fears and hates them, all that stuff is still there. All that stuff is still there. I mean, I think probably the only argument that I could get behind is the semantic argument that like Hickman's literal X-Men title was not an X-Men comic. It should have been called something else. Could have been called, The World of Krakoa. Could have been called even New Mutants. Could have been called, New X-Men even, something like that, right? But literally calling it X-Men was a little weird because there was no superhero team called X-Men doing the protecting stuff. But like I said at the top of this, mutant kind is still protecting the world that fears and hates them. They're just not bending over backwards and like turning both cheeks. They're taking for themselves as they protect this galactic entity. And I think that's different. That is different. Professor X said this dream was wrong. Okay? This dream of, oh, I really think we can all integrate and do it well together. He says, that's never going to work. It's not going to happen. Too much hate. There's too much hate in humanity. I tried, but it's not going to work. That is the part where I know when people say, like, X-Men have to be in this eternal struggle trying to fulfill that dream for it to be X-Men. And personally, I kind of disagree. I just don't think they need to be in that. I think actually characters coming and going through experiences that change their view on that question does not change the relationship and the role of mutants in the Marvel Universe. Again, Professor X is radicalized by information that is presented to him by Moira X. That information changes his viewpoints. He is still views himself as, an almost godlike figure to mutant kind, as a leader and a shepherd for all of mutant kind. And I just think that evolution and that change, it's just changed X-Men. It's just evolved X-Men. It is not at all removed from what we know about Marvel Comics. I mean, truthfully, like, I know a lot of people say this, but, like, House of X and Powers 10 aren't amazing starting places. Like, I am way better for knowing a lot about X-Men in reading those comics. Now, they're, like, some of the best superhero comic starting places you can get to, but that says more about how hard it is to create, like, genuine entry points in superhero comics. But what I'm saying is, like, they're rooted in the legacy of mutant kind. They're rooted in the legacy of Claremont, of 1991's X-Men, of Age of Apocalypse even, of Grant Morrison, right? And then of, like, the Mike Carey run. They're rooted in that legacy. They're rooted in those X-Men comics. Hickman didn't just drop in East of West into the Marvel Universe. It doesn't work without the legacy. It doesn't work without the history of these characters. It doesn't have the same impact. So that's where I think we absolutely still have an X-Men comic. And again, like they even before we had the Duggan literal superhero protection, you have X-Men protecting this world. They have a vested interest in protecting this world. They have mutant kind protecting their world from the threats in Ten of Swords, right? From Arakko. They now have, carving out a space on planet Arakko on Mars. They are protecting from threats galactic and planning for the threats of the Phalanx and the future Dominions and these sorts of things. So I think there's a lot there. I think there's a lot that remains X-Men. I know some people will continue to disagree, but that's, that's why I talk about it. I think it's an interesting question. All right, we have a final question here from New Type. Thanks for your support here in the Super Chat. Hey man, hope you're doing well. Anyway, shouldn't X-Statics show up on Krakoa? For me, I was a fan of the original Milligan Allred series. Tyke Alucard has been seen on Krakoa. Dupe has been seen on Krakoa. So a handful of the X-Statics originals. And if you haven't read X-Statics, Peter Milligan, Mike Allred series, one of the best mutant verse comics of the early 2000s. One of my favorites, just of the millennium, for sure. Love that series. Love it, love it. A couple have shown up. I could use more X-Statics. I could definitely use more full X-Statics. I am in full agreement that a mini-series or something would be awesome. I think probably it's better if it's not Milligan again. He's touched it, and he touched Dupe again, in the last decade or so. Great creator, but I think just inject some new life into it, inject somebody with a different viewpoint, and I'd love to see X-Statics get resurrected. So, all right. Thanks, everybody, for listening. This has been the return of Casual Krakoa. And again, I'll be back next week. Please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting here on the channel. All that helps me, and it'll help when I'm posting videos, when I'm coming back live, all that fun stuff. So thanks everybody for listening, and as always, enjoy the comics.